Hurricane Idalia's catastrophic strike on the state, but is now a still extremely dangerous category.
This camera captured the dramatic moment when Hurricane Idalia made landfall on the northwest coastline of Florida. The camera was placed 10 foot above ground, but within minutes the storm surge had swept through the beachfront town, tearing down structures as winds of more than 100 miles an hour continued to push the water ashore.
Oh yeah, here we go.
The Category 3 hurricane was the most powerful to hit the so-called Big Bend region of Florida in 125 years. Fortunately, an area not as densely populated as the rest of the state.
This is something people in this lifetime, in this area, have never seen in person.
It had been a tropical storm just 24 hours before, but as it barreled towards the coast, Idalia rapidly intensified as it swept up the record warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico, a phenomenon exacerbated by climate change. Hot water acts like rocket fuel for hurricanes by increasing their wind speed, which is exactly what happened with Idalia. This is another intense hurricane we're seeing in the Gulf. How much do you attribute the impact of climate change for what's happening here?
I think it's very difficult to ignore that, especially with how unseasonably warm the waters have been, from the Keys to the lower Atlantic and to the Gulf of Mexico.
Oh my God.
The storm was barely a tropical storm, and all of a sudden it became a threat.
A Category 3 hurricane like Idalia can create catastrophic storm surge, as this illustration graphically shows.
And you can see that about 9 feet of water, way above my head, truly unsurvivable.
But as dramatic as the images are, Idalia made landfall at low tide, so the flooding is likely to worsen as high tide approaches, itself coincidentally swollen by a rare blue supermoon.
This is looking over Tampa Bay. You can see the surge. Water's all the way down the street. Nowhere for the water to go.
All of which means Floridians aren't in the clear just yet, and nor are residents in Georgia or South Carolina, which are both set to experience extreme flooding and high winds as Idalia churns her way east before heading back into the Atlantic. And remember, with hurricane season now in full swing, there'll likely be more to come.
Well, earlier I spoke to Professor John Abraham, a climate scientist and professor at the University of St. Thomas in the United States, and asked him to what extent hurricanes like the one we're seeing in Florida are caused by rising temperatures in the oceans.
Well, every hurricane or typhoon that happens nowadays is somehow affected by climate change. We don't say that they're caused by climate change, but they're made worse by climate change. That means that their winds are harder, their size is bigger, and the storm surges more intense and more rainfall. And so with climate change, your expectation would be that we'll have more and more intense hurricanes that are more deadly. Well, absolutely. And that's what we expect to have in the future, but that's also what we've been observing over the past few decades. So if the past tells us anything about the future, this is just the tip of the iceberg. And to what extent has El Nino had a sort of particular, given it rocket boosters, really? Well, El Nino is not going to affect hurricane formation in the Atlantic very much. In fact, it has the potential to decrease it. Really, the issue is that hurricanes are passing over warmer water, and it's the warm water that gives the fuel to these storms, whether they're in the Atlantic, the Pacific, or the Indian Ocean. And that warmer water is primarily caused by human warming. And we talked about the prospect of more intense hurricanes in the future, but also situated in different places. I mean, Florida's always been in the eye of the storm for as long as I can remember, but we're going to look at more northerly regions affected too, aren't we? Well, we expect that the areas that can be hit by hurricanes and typhoons will be larger and larger as the heat spreads in the ocean. I mean, look, people in Florida know hurricanes come. They have building codes that help their residences and buildings withstand these winds. But what happens when hurricanes are regularly hitting places like New York or the west coast of the U.S. or places in Asia that normally don't get hit by hurricanes and typhoons? That will be a big cause of destruction in those areas that aren't prepared. So across the globe, aside from hurricanes, what are the most worrying impacts of rising sea temperatures? The oceans drive our weather. Oceans cover 70% of our planet, and they provide the heat and humidity that fuel weather. So I don't care where you live. You can live on the coast, you can live in Greenland, you can live in the Sahara Desert. Your weather is being affected by climate change and warming oceans. And specifically what warming oceans are doing is making the weather more wild, and the weather goes from one extreme to the other and then back more frequently and violently. So heat waves with droughts, and then a deluge and a flood, and then back to heat wave and droughts. That's a prevalent pattern that is happening around the world, even for places not near the oceans.
So you can, in a way, draw a line from the rising ocean temperatures to the wildfires that we've seen in Canada, for example, and across the Mediterranean this year.
Yeah, that's right. Look, the Mediterranean Sea is super hot right now. It is scorching hot. And that has contributed to 2 heat waves in southern Europe. I mean, we have Greece and Italy in their second heat wave of the year. And that heat and dryness contributes to wildfires. And the same thing is happening in Canada, which is in my neck of the woods. So look, there is no weather today that is not being affected by our warming oceans.
Professor John Abraham, thank you very much.
Pleasure.